We're often referred to as the sandwich generation, and there's a reason for that.
It is time to put yourself first. It's time to take advantage of those unique opportunities that come along, particularly from a contributions perspective.
Not enough people are talking about this.
Hi there, and welcome back to Super Insider, your podcast for all things super and retirement. Now, my name is Ruth Weaver, and today I'm joined by one of our retirement experts, Josh van Gestel. Welcome, Josh.
Hi, Ruth. Good to be here with you.
It's great to have you with us. Now, you're not just a retirement expert. You also have another very special title. What's that?
Well, I think I'm quite special anyway, Ruth. But my other special title is that I'm a Gen Xer.
You've got great company, many Gen Xers out there. So today's conversation is all about the challenges that a Gen Xer might face for various different reasons.
Yep.
What would they be?
Well, we're often referred to as the sandwich generation, and there's a reason for that. And that is that think about us as an individual being stuck in the middle between parents who really are needing elder care. We're seeing a lot at the moment where we're having to think about the emotional support, financial support, health support of parents. We've also got young kids, or they may now be becoming older teenagers or young adults, and we have to think about many of them are still wanting support, and some of them are still very dependent upon us. And then there's us wedged in the middle of the sandwich who often we're not actually thinking about our retirement, which is actually getting quite close.
And that's what we're going to cover today. But before we do, it is important to remember that all of this conversation is going to be done through the lens of a very general advice nature, bearing in mind we don't know anybody's personal or financial circumstances. So let's start with the parent layer, if you like. And there are lots of challenges there. You know, people are living longer. People are, suppose, in this generation are watching their parents live much longer lives. But with that, whilst it is a blessing, it does bring some challenges as well.
Yeah, and I think I come from a very personal perspective on this. As you'd know, I've got two very elderly parents, or my father actually passed away late last year. But it was a real consideration around, especially for Dad. We had 12 months where we were having to think about aged care, which is confronting, confusing. We weren't really planned for it. It just was thrust upon us. And that brought with it a lot of emotional stress. It brought with it a lot of stress for supporting Mum. So there was definitely a very, very big financial burden that we just didn't even know where to start. But I think it's also important to think around the investment of self, your own emotion, and the time with that. The reason why it's important that we raise it, and I know we're not going to cover off a checklist of solutions here for that, but I think it's important that people in my generation, in Gen X, where they do have elderly parents who are maybe approaching that stage in life, that it becomes a part of your discussion.
Yeah.
What is that elder care plan going to be? What is it that your parents may want or need? Because I know from personal experience, waiting for that moment where it has to happen, it isn't going to come easy. And there really is a lot that you have to think about.
Yeah, there is the emotional, but also the financial taxing side of it that can really play a draining role, if you like, on a generation of individuals who are so time poor as it already is.
Well, and we'll talk about the other elements of the sandwich, but it does become a very big part of your overall stress, anxiety, concerns and thinking. Yep.
So parents aside, let's skip a generation and we'll go back to the children. And one of the reflections I think that we're starting to see is, number one, I think you're of a generation where, you know, people generally started having children a little bit later in life. But also, you know, kids today, because of various different reasons, they often are financially dependent for a lot longer than they used to be. So there's a couple of challenges, or I suppose different types of things to consider in that generation too.
And I know for both of us, I know you're in a younger generation.
Just about. I actually just about missed the cusp of Gen X, so I'm technically Gen Y.
It's like talking about star signs. I'm the cusp of...
You're on the cusp, yeah.
I know for us, though, a very big part of our lives, and we talk about it and share it just working together, is we've got kids in high school. And there's still a journey there. You then think about what happens after that. And as you said, they're dependent for much longer. I know that your daughter's only just started work, the first one. And that's important because I think it comes with, especially if I think about it from an educator's perspective, it's not just how we're supporting kids financially, but how are we giving them the tools and the ability to start supporting themselves. With the sandwich generation, when you've got concerns about parents and yourself, which we'll talk about at the moment, sometimes with the kids, it's almost like, well, just what do I need to do?
Yeah, that's it.
It's certainly from a financial perspective. And it's really important that we think around, well, how are we actually setting our kids up? We are a generation that we are probably in our best income earning capacity. We've probably got our best wealth capacity to some extent, probably thinking about paying down debts and other things. How do we actually think about our kids within that? How do we start to actively set our kids up for their own success?
It's not like when you and I turned 18, suddenly you were sort of free
Here's
to
a
go.
backpack,
It's so
go
much.
explore
Here's
the
the
world.
backpack, off you go. It really is different now. We do see that this new generation coming through, they are living at home for longer. Often for reasons out of their control, cost of living, for example, finding housing is really, really difficult. So that all flows back to Gen X, I suppose, in an inadvertent way.
And I think that's where a lot of our worries come from as parents.
Yeah.
How are we going to help our children through that? And you think about what we've already discussed, being overwhelmed with parents, potentially. Overwhelmed with thinking about your kids, both how do we look after them now, but for the future as well.
So we're worried about parents and their finances, amongst other things. We're worried about kids for various reasons, plus their finances. And, as a super fund, there's not a lot that we can do to support either of those challenges in your life. But what we can do is to support this generation, the Gen Xers, with their own retirement planning and their own financial control, if you like.
That's right. And that's actually the part of our lives we don't tend to actually think about.
This is it.
If I look at it from a superannuation provider lens, we've got a whole group of people, our boomers, and they're all really moving into retirement now. Our Gen Xers are our next wave of retirees, and they tend to be people that are born between 1965 and 1980. My son would say that's the late 1900s, I think makes me feel very old. But this is a group that is in the prime of their superannuation life. It is their time to really, really do something with their super. If I think about the statistics around this, we tend to see that men have an average of about $230,000 to $350,000 in their super at this age. Women, there is a real consideration we should talk about, that women have about $150,000 to $230,000 in their super. So there is a gap there that we need to consider. But the other thing to consider is that really, for this generation, they should be looking at having at least $600,000 in savings as a single person, and a tiny bit more than that if they're part of a couple.
And that number, of course, is at retirement. It's not, it's not in the early, for those listening who might be in their late 40s or 50s, those numbers are based on those individuals who are 65 or above and are just about to retire. If I could bring back the conversation around women, it is a topic that's really close to my heart. I've worked in superannuation for a long time, and a real passion project for me is around raising financial literacy for women in particular, because I am so mindful of the super gap that exists, and for all the reasons that are that have created that problem. I do want to, I suppose, acknowledge the fact that it's not just a personal project for me, if you like, or a personal interest. Art is working really hard to advocate strongly for our women members.
Absolutely.
We're a fund that has more than half of its membership are females. So we understand the importance that superannuation is going to play for financial freedom for our own members.
And I think we've talked a bit about Gen X being a generation worrying about parents and kids. I'd say that is more so for women.
100%,
That
yeah.
when it comes to women in general, but certainly for this generation, the last person they're going to think about is often themselves.
Yeah.
Certainly when it comes to their superannuation and thinking about retirement. A couple of other things have also contributed to this issue. Gen X are the last generation that wouldn't have probably had full superannuation support through their working lives. At the point that we started working, superannuation was just becoming compulsory and it was at a very low level. So it means that we as a generation, particularly for women, are going to have potentially a savings gap there. And the way that we have to address that is by actually making contributions. And what I should say, Ruth, sometimes this generation, we're getting close to retirement, but maybe we don't think we are.
There's often a lot of denial out there. How close?
Absolutely denial. But it's the point in our lives where the action we take today is actually going to be quite significant.
It is an interesting point because even though, to your point, you're getting closer to retirement than many Gen Xers are willing to admit or want to admit, but in the same breath, there's still plenty of time to make some significant changes and to your superannuation and really change the trajectory of what you're doing and the path that you're on.
I think that goes back to the point about being selfish. Yeah, you're managing parents and kids, but also think about what are you doing to set yourself up for in 5, 10, 15 years' time.
So if you are a Gen Xer, you're very time poor, you're at the peak of your career, so there's a lot of demands from work. You've got kids or teenagers at home demanding lots of things. You've got parents who might need some support as well at this stage. Yes, it is a time to be selfish, but let's just acknowledge the time poor element here. If you are someone that's saying, look, just make this easy for me, what are the first things or the easiest things that somebody could do?
I think there's actually 3 things. The first is don't ignore that your retirement is coming. I'd actually say to you, particularly since my dad passed last year, I've actually actively started thinking about, well, how do I want to get some balance into my life? What might the shifts be that I have in my career in 5, 10 years? I'm actively really thinking about not necessarily retirement, but my next step towards it. And I'd encourage that of everyone. Get online, do a retirement forecaster, get a sense of where your balance is and where it needs to go, and don't ignore it or be naive to it. That'd be the first thing. The second thing is then, if that forecast doesn't look great, if it's not where you want it, start to think about the capacity you have to shift it. And there's 2 ways to do that. The first is by making contributions. And if you're not in a position to be making big contributions, well, how do you just start paying a bit more to supplement the contributions your employer puts in, but doing that regularly? If you're doing that over the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, with investment earnings, that's going to actually compound and be quite significant.
And I think it's important on the contributions point to highlight a couple of things. And I, again, highlighting my passion project here for women in particular. It's a generation where we often see a lot of women return to work, return back to work after maybe rearing children.
That's right.
Or moving from part-time work back into full-time work. And just being aware of the opportunities here to start contributing tax effectively. So it's so important. And it's not just exclusive to women, but if you are moving from a part-time position or non-working back into the workforce, we see a lot of it in Gen X, be aware.
And there's also the opportunity with that. We've got what's called catch-up contributions, where if there's years where you haven't been making contributions, you might have some capacity to put in something more. It's also, I think, a period, you mentioned that it's peak earning, or it's where you're actually generating probably your most income. And it's probably also the period where you're starting to maybe get on top of your debt or really thinking about how you're minimizing that debt. Might mean you've just got to think about, well, how do I build some capacity in that to contribute? The other thing, Ruth, particularly for women, and we do tend to see that women aren't paid as well. You might see that a lot of them are still part-time going through this period of their lives. It's also thinking about the opportunities that also brings from the government in terms of support through things like the low-income super tax offset, also thinking about co-contributions. Government will put in some for you.
And being aware of those for your children as well. So bringing back to the kids, you know, what can you as a Gen Xer who are trying to rear and these kids who we want to be financially literate and financially independent at some days, it's also being aware of those opportunities and highlighting them to kids who might be starting out, or, you know, if you're entering into the grandparent stage and you've got kids who might be starting to drop back themselves, there's just a lot going on there to be mindful of.
I would have been very disappointed. I know this isn't the fact, but I would have been very disappointed if when your daughter started work a few months ago, you didn't set her up in a super fund. So
it was one of the first things I thought of is, let's get that super account open. She was not her priority, I can tell you, as a 15-year-old.
But I think that first thing, as I said, is that contributions. Think about capacity and what you can do. The second thing, which I think we don't, maybe up until now, we're a generation that just let it do what it's doing, is what can you do with your investments? You're maybe in your mid-40s, early 50s. You've got the opportunity to still think about your investments as being long-term. Don't think about, well, I've got 5, 10, 15 years to retirement. Think about, really, I've still got my super probably as an asset for the next 30, 35, 40 years. That's a long investment horizon. It gives you the opportunity to think about, how can I invest my super where I'm comfortable? How can I invest it for growth and maybe be a little bit more assertive with it? I'd say those are the three key things. Do the forecaster. Don't ignore retirement is coming. Actually lean into it. And then think about that contribution element as well as your investments.
So if you've done all of that, so you've done the forecaster, maybe you liked what you saw, but maybe you didn't. So you know that there's a little bit of work to do. We've talked about the two levers that are at your disposal to really bridge that gap, which is trying to get money into the system, maybe reassessing the way that money is invested. What more can your super fund do for you then if you're at that point where you think, look, I just need that extra little bit of information or support or guidance here? What should someone do?
What we're doing as a super fund is we're making sure that our members have a lot more access to the information about their superannuation through things like mobile apps, online access, but it's also access to more knowledge to allow them to really start to explore their needs. And that could be anything from attending a seminar in your workplace through to jumping onto our website and exploring things about contributions or investments or whatever it may be. The other thing is, though, that when you think also about your parents and your kids, and again, if I look at it personally, there was a point with the situation we were in with Dad last year where we were having to move him from hospital. He had an accident straight into aged care, where we had to put our hand up and go, you know what? This isn't something we know how to deal with.
Yeah.
And whether it's to do with your parents, your kids, or your own super, I think it's also acknowledging that point where, when do I need to lean in on someone to get some guidance, get some help? Now, in that situation, I was actually very fortunate. I had a close friend who is a financial advisor who Australian Retirement Trust actually works with. I know they're a specialist on aged care, and I was able to reach out and just say, hey, don't need your advice on this, but I'd really welcome you giving us some direction on what we should be thinking about. That starts the journey for you then to go, well, do I actually need deeper advice? Do I need to discuss this and get some real support and guidance on it? Or is this something that I'm committed to looking at?
Going back to the parents again, and I'm probably going to sound a little bit harsh here and, you know, talking about it from the financial lens, so we'll park the obvious emotional challenges that are there as well. When we're hosting events, we often get a lot of members tell us that they've just received an inheritance. So they have had a parent recently pass, or both parents, and there is often this lump sum of money that can come around when you're at that stage as well, and it's really looking for, information on what options they have to maybe use that money to help bridge their own superannuation gap?
Ruth, it's amazing. I actually think that that's the time for many people that they first actually start engaging with their super.
100% agree, yeah.
They've had this tragic event occur, they've come into inheritance, and thinking about how they're going to deal with it, and a light bulb almost goes off, and it might be from seeing their parents' situation. I'd say there's two things with that. First is, yes, you could think about how you contribute part of that inheritance into your own super, and there's great capacity for doing that. Okay. If you do come into a large inheritance, I'd just say again, start to explore your options or reach out, because that is something that you can use to close your own gap. The other thing, though, is I'd say it should almost be a light bulb moment for going, well, we've had to handle things for our parents. Do I want my kids to go through this, where we've got kids? Do I want my kids to go through that same experience with me? So I think it's actually allowing you to think about two things. How am I going to have that inheritance help me? But especially now that my super is going to be more valuable in that instance, how do I make sure it's set up properly that if something happens to me, that money's looked after? And that might be anything from thinking about nomination of beneficiaries right through to going, I need to make sure my estate's in order, or even thinking about, well, what's my own care intentions? I know we don't want to think that far ahead, but do you think that retirement living will form part of your retirement? Or do you think eventually you'll be in aged care or whatever it may be? But let that reality allow you to question your own.
It is the point I was actually going to raise. So you raised it in advance. It was around the estate planning side of it. So thinking about, the Gen X generation with elderly parents, just having those conversations with your parents to make sure that their wishes can be met. And that might be through superannuation beneficiaries, for example. But of course, looking at your own, what happens if something happened to you? Do you have that? And I think it is a good opportunity to stop and think, are things set up properly? Do I have an estate plan? And an estate plan doesn't have to be as technical as the words might sound. It can be quite simple.
And the other thing, Ruth, and I hate to keep referencing back to this, but I think from my perspective, that would have allowed me to be more present with Dad, especially in that period towards his death. How are you just there for him? Not having to worry about,
being distracted by the logistics and
cherish that period of their life where you've got the ability to do so. And I was very blessed. We got a lot of time with Dad, but make sure you're maximizing that. You don't want to spend that time worrying,
trying to get everything in order. When you can actually have a lot of those things already in place. So to your point, you can cherish those last months and years. I completely agree. It is time to put yourself first. It's time to take advantage of those unique opportunities that come along, particularly from a contributions perspective. Take advantage of the time that you still do have to maximize your earnings, the compound earnings that you've got. So take advantage of those things. But also take advantage of the support and the guidance and the resources that are around you, particularly if you're a member of ourselves. Take advantage of all those things. We do have the advice team. You have access to our rewards program. There's just so many benefits. This is the time for you to go and explore what those benefits are and absolutely take advantage. And to your point, Josh, it is okay to be selfish.
It is okay.
So on that, thank you so much for listening and joining us today. And we'd love to have you join us on our next episode.